Ken, I oftentimes hear skeptics say that Genesis 1 and 2 are two separate creation accounts that actually contradict each other. How can I respond to that?
Yeah, I hear that too, where they'll say that it looked like it was just two borrowed myths that were cobbled together very poorly, and it's a sort of a Frankenstein stitched together. And one would read that or hear that taught a lot 100 years ago. One doesn't hear that today. In fact, when you look very carefully at the Genesis text, and we let the author himself divide it, what we find is that the book of Genesis has 10 chapters, and it has a Toledot formula. These are the generations of, or this is the history of. And we find that in 10 different sections throughout the book of Genesis. And where do we find the first one? In Genesis 2, the beginning there at Genesis 2, 4, and 5. So if we were going to say, where does the first chapter of Genesis begin? It begins in Genesis 2, 4, and 5. So that is the creation account. Well then, what is Genesis 1? It's recognized across the board among Old Testament scholars that Genesis 1 is a prologue. It is a preliminary. It operates much the way John 1, the first 18 verses of John chapter 1 operates in the Gospel of John. In fact, John's Gospel is modeled upon the book of Genesis. That's why John's Gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He is deliberately mimicking Genesis 1:1. And what do we have? We have those first 18 verses operate as a prologue that kind of just sums up the whole narrative. And then he then tells the story of Jesus in the Gospel of John. The same thing is going on in Genesis 1 and 2. We do not have two creation accounts. What we have is the creation account of Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 1 in the 7 days of creation. These are a prologue that just gives an overview. And so one is not supposed to just read Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 and try to figure out how do we reconcile these. Is Genesis 2 the sixth day? That's really not treating Genesis 1 and 2 the way I think the original author intended for us to. We're to understand Genesis 1, the way we have it spelled out, is an overarching grand narrative that the God of Israel is not just a local parochial deity, but that he is indeed the God who created everything, the heavens and the earth. That's why in Genesis 2, you have where God is referred to in a unique way that we find only one other place in the Pentateuch, where he's called the Lord God, Elohim Yehovah. Why is he doing that? He's putting the two together. Israel's God is the God who created all things. And that is how we're to understand Genesis 1.